Great. So yeah, hi everyone. We welcome you once again to this series of webinars on revisiting research in education. Of course, this is provided by a platform that was conceived with Professor Aya Bogoch from Florida Atlantic University, and Rania Sawad from Qatar, and Ibrahim Al-Houthi from Kuwait, and myself. So you can see in the poster that this is in collaboration with ED Enterprise, Hassan Premier University, and Florida Atlantic University in Educational Leadership Network. And of course, the purpose is, as it was said in the title, is to revisit our research practices. So at the same time, look at the relationships between practice and theory, or what we call praxis. So this platform, as you see, tends to provide space for education researchers to come together, of course, from across the world, to discuss research participant relationships and research methodologies. So we are tending to cast a critical eye at research practices in education and ask questions. I think that we may not have answers. Almost not everyone has the answers, but we are trying to ask the right questions. We're trying to, we're working together with our speakers and renowned researchers and scholars in this field to cast, as I said, a critical eye and scrutinize the research in this field. We're also trying to encourage ourselves and other researchers and practitioners to revisit current practices and ask new questions, adjusting methodologies accordingly. So today's session, of course, is the title is revisiting or decolonizing research methods in education or education research. And we are going to have Professor Ira and Professor Ann Lopez with us. So what we need to remember is we want to revisit current practices, we want to ask new or more relevant questions, and we want to share insights via blogs, social media studies, networks. And I think that's why Rania started recording the webinar, because we want to keep track of some of the ideas that are shared with us through the speakers and through you, of course, the audience, and see to what extent we can kind of transform that into writing through blogs or social media and studies and social and so on and so forth. And everyone is welcome to participate in this, to co-create this. Rania, I think that's, well, the moderators, as you've seen, so today I'm going to moderate the session together with Rania. We're sorry that we don't have Professor Ibrahim with us. I hope he's fine, and I hope he'll join us very soon. So the speakers, as I said, are Professor Ira, who is from Florida Atlantic University. So as you see, that's how he wants to introduce himself. So he said that he is not a trained methodologist. So what he wants us to do is use this fact to our advantage. So I let him probably explain that later, because I don't really understand it very well. But he has two manuscripts in press. One is a solo authored genealogy of his research journey, questioning the efficacy of education leadership research methods. The other is a collaboration titled Decolonizing Research Methods. As you see, it's appropriate to today's discussion. And he will be drawing on both to ask and answer the webinar's questions. And his other avenue of scholarship is in education leadership of social justice. And the last thing you need to know about him, of course, as he says, is his willingness to travel alone to both Canada and Germany to study how public schools and communities were welcoming Syrian newcomers in 2017. That's an interesting, a very, very interesting experience that I read through the web before meeting Professor Ira in Boca 2 years ago. Dr. Ann Lopez is a Jamaican-born professor of education leadership and policy at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto, Canada. She is the director of the Center for Leadership and Diversity, co-director of the Center for Black Studies in Education and Diversity, and Vocal Advisor, Access Programs 2017-2023. She's a former classroom teacher and school administrator. She helps the position.
Ibrahim Al-Howdy is the co-host now.
I'm sorry, this is something in my lab. So she holds the position of academic director, initial teacher education, and her research, teaching, and scholarly work primarily focuses on anti-racist, decolonizing education, equity, and diversity in education and schooling, and school leadership across contexts, particularly in the global South. Dr. Lopez is the author of several journal articles and books, including her most recent book entitled Decolonizing Educational Leadership. So as you see, she is one of the experts in domain, or at least the discussion that we're going to have today. And we are so happy to have her with us. She is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of School Leadership and co-series editor Studies in Education Administration. And Professor Lopez has been honored for her work and is the recipient of the OISE 2020 Award for Distinguished Contributions to Teaching in the 2022 University of Toronto Award of Excellence in GUS Memorial Human Rights Prize Influential Leader. Rania, I'll give you the floor to talk a little bit about our last session.
And what an introduction. We're so honored to have you all with us. And we're so keen to go through the journey that you will discuss with us about decolonization. However, we asked our participants just to share with us your names, where are you from, and something that you would like to tell us, and if you attended the first session or not. I can see some familiar names, so help us to remind and to refresh what we have discussed in the first one. So some of the questions that we asked: what's the current status of education leadership research? And we're focusing on education leadership. Definitely, we cannot discuss all the other topics or other sectors. But we believe not only because of our major, but because education leadership has a major role in designing and providing those kind of education opportunities. And how we can re-examine education research methodologies. So we're discussing methodologies because if we keep doing the same things, we will keep having the same results, and we all know this. It's now how we are asking different questions, and we're allowing ourselves just to go back to the basics and start understanding the context and understanding our needs, while some of those kind of education research methodologies or some of the practices that we're having had come from the West or come from different contexts, or they will come different reasons. Dr. Adnan Amin was with us, with Prof. Ira also. So Dr. Adnan Amin was discussing with us about his book, Intaj al-Faragh, Production of the Void. And he was describing some of the practices in the Arab countries, and we were sharing some practices and perspectives from around the world. Dr. Ira had talked to us on different steps about how we move from learning to research. Sometimes we only focus on the structure and moving from step to another without really allowing ourselves to researching to learn, that we want to explore new things. We want to see things from a different perspective, a different angle, or to see how we can really direct it so that we can learn or answer the questions that we have, or maybe be open to see different practices. So this is basically some of the things that we have. And now we will be sharing, we had in the first session, we will be sharing the link with you if you would like to attend that session, or if you didn't attend it with us. And we will be more than happy to read your comments, your feedback. And remember what Abdulaziz had highlighted. We're here to allow ourselves to share ideas, to ask different questions. We're not here to force you to do something that maybe you don't see how you're going to implement it, but just allow yourself to think about it in a different way and to see how we can evolve those kind of discussions. The floor is yours, Abdulaziz, and Dr. Ira, Dr. Anna.
Thank you so much, Rania. So, of course, as you see in the shared slide with all of us here, the agenda for today's session, we're going to start by defining key concepts. So we want to focus on concepts like colonization, decolonization, education, and education leadership. What do they mean? And try to frame them before we delve into a deeper discussion. We want to try to link theory, practice, and research methods through a few questions. So with like the bridge between theory and practice. So bridging the bridge, as they say. bridging the gaps between theory, praxis, and research methods. So we'll be illuminated, hopefully, showcasing how these elements intertwine in the context of decolonization. And at the end, we want to navigate how indigenous cultures and cross-cultural interactions can enrich educational research and research methods, recognizing the diverse world we live in and how all cultures have contributed to building knowledge. We would like to open by providing somehow between 6 to 10 minutes. So hopefully we'll have our speakers collaborate with us and make this as brief as possible, but we want also to learn as much as we can from them, but we know that we have time restrictions. So we'll give Professor Anne and Professor Ira 10 minutes time to give us opening statements around the issue of the decolonizing research. Well, would they say ladies first? Ira, what do you think? Thank you, my friend. So, if you don't mind, Professor Anne,
sure.
We are so happy to have you. Thank you again for joining. Thank you for your time. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. So, first of all, I just want to say thanks to Dr. Abdelaziz, Dr. Rania, Dr. Ibrahim for organizing this webinar on decolonizing educational research. I am really honored to be invited and to be in space with my dear colleague who has inspired me so much. And really, from the moment I met him, really asked those questions that caused me to think differently about educational leadership. And really, in many ways, and I have to say this, modeled much of what we're going to talk about today. And is that humanity, is that stepping outside of academia, and that is Dr. Ira. And so I'm just happy to be in the same space with you, Dr. Ira, and for all that you've contributed to the field, and be here to share that space with you. I also would like to appreciate those who have joined us online, because taking time to participate is also intentional. And so I truly appreciate that. And as Dr. Abdelaziz says, you know, what we're engaging in is really, in many ways, critical dialogue, conversations. And if you leave this webinar with some new ideas, some new ways of thinking about the work, some new ways of thinking about research, I think some of our goals would have been met. And I really like the idea that we're not giving recipes, we're not giving answers, but we're really creating space for thinking. And so as I start, I just want to start by saying that my entry point into this is thinking about decolonizing praxis, not as a new issue or accidental. In fact, those who have been colonized have always resisted colonization. And the process of decolonization itself, because it's a process, it's not an activity, it's ongoing, has to be intentional. It's not something that we can wing or sort of step into, step out of. I think as educational leaders, scholars, practitioners, when we make the commitment to engage in this work, there's a level of intentionality around it. And I really talked about not being new, because there's a way in which the way decolonizing discourse now is sort of ubiquitous. It's everywhere, that some might think, oh, it's new. But as I say, those in spaces where colonization with colonization have always resisted in various ways and forms and means and understanding. And so again, when we think about praxis, and as Dr. Abdelaziz says, that we're going to be sort of engaging with these terms and maybe have different notions of what they are and how we understand them. But I think most of us, all of us, in fact, maybe really understands that practice means connecting theory to practice. That's praxis. And so my entry point into the conversation will be focused on how to connect practical actions, not recipes of actions, but really sort of diverse ways of engaging practically with the understandings of what decolonization means as educational leaders, scholars, and practitioners, and that understanding is contextual. The contexts across the globe are so different. And so as it's so important, again, that we're not giving recipes, but ways of thinking of engaging with theory within our different contexts. So one of the things that I was asked to think about as we were thinking through this and what we are going to share is really what undergirded our philosophy. And so of this work of decolonial, decolonizing praxis. And for me, what undergirded that journey and started that journey for me was I was drawn to this thinking from my early days as an undergraduate, when I went to the University of the West Indies and started to realize that my colonial K-12 education was literally a miseducation. The way it engaged with the history of my ancestors, the knowledge that was being shared, it was like a light bulb that was coming on when I was given the book by Walter Rodden to read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. For the first time in my entire life, the whole notion and context and concept of Africa was totally shifted on its head. Another book I was given to read was, I think, by the name of an author called Domhoff, who talked about the 5% who owned 95% of the wealth in Jamaica at the time. All of that knowledge was really turned on its head prior to, to what I was learning in K-12. And so it began to make me think about the kind of knowledge that I was given as in my education, and really beginning to think through that. And another entry point, of course, it sort of made me begin to think about education from the perspectives of, I was given an education from the perspectives of the colonizers, and it began to realize that was a perspective. It was not the perspective, but for so long, all of that knowledge is posited, is brought into space as the knowledge. And my place of that colonial education, as I've said before, was Jamaica. So as Linda Tuhewi Smith, and I hope I'm saying her name right, suggests, we come from place. All of us come from place. All of us come from a context. And to connect with that place, we must connect with our ancestors. We must connect with our ancestors. And so for me, it's sort of, as I was having that connection, then it's really meant I had to begin to learn in different ways, new things. So as I think about and talk about my philosophy of decolonizing praxis, it then for me is about a quest to understand more about my history, my ancestors, and about their colonizing experiences. Because if we do not understand colonization and the many ways in which it is manifested, we cannot decolonize. Because the D in front of colonization means just that. And so that is very important to understand those experiences, the colonizing experiences of those who were and continue to be, because colonization in many ways has not ended. In some spaces, occupation of land might be, but all of the other systems, the structures, policies, practices are still in place in some places. So then the question that I want us to think about, how do we engage in this praxis? And so I'm arguing that it comes from a place and a space of wanting to settle and dislodge colonial logics and structures that we know are harmful to those who have been colonized and their descendants. So in other words, and I really wanted to say this again, there are no good sides of colonization. There were no benefits. There were no sort of making the uncivilized civilized. So that discourse has to be disrupted as well, intentionally, as we engage in this work. And here I draw on Abdi, and he's a Canadian scholar who argues that decolonizing praxis disturbs the structural as well as the functional coherence of the official knowledge and learning discourses and the focus of Eurocentric meta-narratives. And so that's very important. That whole idea of disturbing and unsettling is really an intentional part of this work. Then the question becomes, how do we do that in our context? And Marie Baptiste, you might want to grab her book. She's an Indigenous scholar from Canada, and amazing scholar. And she argues and makes and reminds us that to decolonize is to actively, and I want to underline that word, actively resist colonial paradigms. So there's intentionality, there's actively resisting. So decolonization is not a passive process, it's an active process. And of course, we'll all understand that active process in our own context. A big question then, which I think is the focus of this webinar, is how do scholars and practitioners and community members in the field of education and leadership engage in research with this focus and goal, the focus and goal of unlearning, decentering Eurocentricity, actively resisting, intentionality. What does that mean within our field, and how do we do it? So I'm not pretending to have the answers, because I don't have them. I'm a work in progress constantly and all the time, engaging with the contestations and all of the contradictions and so on. That, you know, we could have a whole webinar on those, but rather to posit some questions that we can think through as we take up this work. So my focus is really then to put into space right now, what might some of those questions be as you do research? So to do that, I just quickly want to revisit the definition of research. Research means the creation of new knowledge or the use of existing knowledge to generate new concepts, methodologies, and understandings. And that I think is critical, because when we begin to think of research as new knowledge, then and within a decolonizing framework and praxis, it leads us then to some questions that we have to ask if we are going to unsettle colonial logics and decenter Eurocentricity. And as Dr. Rania just said, we can't do the same things this all the time and expect to get different answers or results. So it means that research cannot be constituted or thought of in the old paradigms. And so as we sort of think about this, then decolonial praxis and decolonizing praxis, then I'm suggesting it is about unlearning as a first entry point. So we, as education leaders, scholars, practitioners, when we start this work, we really have to begin to say to ourselves, this research, this undertaking cannot be to simply sort of verify what we already know in the old paradigms and old logics. It has to, in the generation of new knowledge, explore then how research is conducted. Who conducts it? Where is it conducted? What kind of knowledge is generated? And for what purpose? Those are what I'm suggesting within decolonizing research within our field that we have to begin to ask. And I just want to give some examples. So, you know, if we're at school as education and leadership researchers, we oftentimes go into schools and do research with head teachers, principals, or with teachers, or we go into communities and so on. I think as we're doing that now, in my mind, a way of translating into practice will be thinking about, how am I going to engage with those head teachers or principal? How do I navigate and disrupt those power differentials? All of that. How is this research going to be of benefit to them? Am I just coming to extract knowledge, go away, write, publish, you know, move up in the academia, and the people never see me or hear from me again? So all of those questions, I think we have to ask as we think through decolonizing work. So I'm suggesting that we have to then think about and examine the knowledge then that is generated. How is the research disrupting colonial structures, policies, and practices? And I really want to pause quickly at that one and say it again. How is the research then disrupting those structures and policies? And the last thing I want to say about that, as we do this kind of work in the field of education and leadership, within the decolonizing research praxis, think about relationships. How are those relationships that we create and form in our research maintained and sustained? How do we intentionally sustain those relationships? Because if those relationships are not there, then it becomes extractive. It becomes all kinds, and it's not decolonizing. So that, I think, is important as well. And so with that, I'm suggesting then decolonizing work should also speak to our identities, because we are implicated in this as well. Speak to our identities. It should really recenter knowledge that was suppressed and not valued. We also, if we're engaging in this research, particularly as we engage with community, is to think about and acknowledge and recognize that knowledge resides in community and not always in academia. And that is so important. And I draw on Linda Tuhiri Smith here again, who says that knowledge is about education, health, healing. We might want to talk to our school principals about how they're healing from the trauma of the spaces in which they work. Acknowledging that there might be trauma there, and what are their sources of that healing? Have we as educational leaders asked those questions? Or are we always asking questions about competencies? So it is the questions that we ask. And so therefore the goal of decolonizing research, as I'm sort of asking us to think through this, should be about bringing alternative knowledge. And somebody have been called on for the use of the word alternative. So that's another sort of language we can take up again, but really the kind of knowledge that we're bringing to the fore. So within educational leadership, it means therefore that scholars, students, practitioners should reflect on the field, the history of the field of educational leadership, and ask themselves, what leadership paradigms and practices are we holding on to that still have these colonial thinking and processes that we want to decolonize? What exactly is it that we're decolonizing? So in practical terms, maybe it's a framework for practices. Conferences earlier on this evening, before we started, Dr. Ara was talking about the publications and all of those things. Who has a seat? And for me, a big question is, who has a seat at the table in educational leadership organizations? Who has a seat at the table? Whose voice is heard and not heard? And so as I sort of wrap up here, we must therefore ask ourselves, what are our commitments to intentionality and to change, not only of the knowledge, but of the space from which the knowledge is generated? Because so often in educational leadership, that field is dominated by scholars from the global north and by scholars in the global south and other spaces, feeling as if their scholarship is not valid or valid until it looks like something coming from the global north, or they have to adjust in order to get a seat at the table. So I will end by saying that if we're to decolonize, it might be a process of building our own tables or knocking down the existing table. And I leave you to think about what that might mean in practice as well as in theory. Thank you. That's my opening.
Wow. What do you think, Professor Bogot? This is huge, yeah? This is a framework, I think, for decolonizing research, yeah? I'll give you the floor, Professor Bogot, to share your ideas before we start asking the questions.
Thank you so much. I too want to just begin by thanking Rania, Ibrahim, and Abdulaziz for making this platform available to all of us to share in the learning. In many ways, Ann Lopez is responsible for my thinking about research methods. I'm not a methodologist, that was said in my introduction. And I think that what I ask everybody here is to find the methodologist that's within us, even as we're not trained as methodologists, and to use the lack of training. So Dr. Lopez was referring to the unlearning. I think the advantage that someone like myself has is that I don't have to unlearn very much. I don't know very much about the techniques of methodology, and I'm not interested so much in the techniques as I am in the spirit of research methods, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But I do think that in the field of educational leadership, we've been much too reliant reliant on so-called experts to tell us, so how do we study this? How do we answer this? And so the same mental energy that we bring to ideas of leadership, we should be bringing to ideas of methodology, and we're not. So my first major point would be that I want to move away from the idea of choosing a research method, going to the bookshelves and taking a book and saying, okay, I'm going to choose this quantitative method. I'm going to choose this qualitative method. Instead, I want us to look at the theories that we're thinking about. I want us to look at the participants from whom we're learning from. I want us to look at the context in which we're doing the work. And I think if we look at the theories, the participants, and the context, the methods will come to us. So the whole idea of moving away from choosing a method to developing methods, to creating methods, to tailoring the methods to theories, communities, and context for each and every study would be a major change in the paradigm of how research is conducted and how research gets published, because it's only by following the rubrics that we've set up, which is the colonial structures that we've set up, that we get the agreement of journal editors, agreement of peer reviewers, but that's not what our research should be about. And so in terms of the spirit of research, I want to, in some sense, I do want to channel the revolutionary spirit of Frantz Fanon. But at the same time, I want to say out loud that I'm not a revolutionary. I am an educational leadership researcher, writer, commentator, critic. And in that sense, I have to use my ideas on leadership and social justice as a way to think about how to liberate the field. And concretely, it's about disrupting our current relationship with participants, with journals, with peer reviewers, and with publishers. And I think at some point we really have to think about the hierarchies that have been created in ed leadership. And therefore, while I love this forum, which allows us to generate new ideas, until we're talking to the gatekeepers themselves, until we're listening to the gatekeepers in a dialogue, we're really not going to be able to make the kinds of changes. I stand always on my privilege as a tenured full professor, but I'm not disrupting the economic, social, and political infrastructures that hold up colonialism. And if you read Frantz Fanon, he really goes way beyond the kind of violence of the mind and the violence of the activities of revolution to understanding these political and economic infrastructures. And until we disrupt that, we're keeping education at a rhetorical level. And I think we could do better than that. But that also speaks to how in so many ways colonialism makes us all complicit in maintaining the status quo. And, Dr. Lopez mentioned publishing and careers. We can't ignore how the incentive system has been created such that it keeps the publishers in power, it keeps the journal editors churning out issue after issue, it keeps the peer reviewers following, staying in line. And there's so much that we have to think about and disrupt, but our complicity in not choosing methods and moving towards developing, designing, and tailoring methods makes us reflective, historical, and contextual. And that's really where I want to go with the way I'll respond to most of Dr. Zuri's questions today. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Bogoch, for these insights. And of course, we were really blessed today to have both of you joining us and giving us these opening statements that kind of put us on track for the discussion. I just ask everyone who is joining us here to feel free to interact as the conversation goes on and on. Just feel free to interact and to comment on the ideas that we're going to hear. Ask questions if you wish, add ideas, ask questions about things that you may want to react to either critically or in your own way. So just feel free. This is an open conversation, and everyone is welcome to delve in and share their point of view. So thank you very much. You've kind of, as I said, set the framework for the discussion, but at the same time, I'm so thrilled. The ideas you've mentioned can be interesting titles for research papers, and maybe thinking of books around that for all the people who are joining us on, who are willing to write research on this issue. I've seen some people joining us writing in the chat that they work on the same field, that they're doing their research studies either in PhD or else on decolonizing different forms of education. My first question would be, it's like linked to what you have started talking about, of probably trying to focus your ideas, the idea that you have already shared on this, and at the same time probably add more important ideas on this question. And I know that Dr. Ann have already given us some insights into this. So where does the process of decolonizing research methods in educational leadership commence? When I raised this question, and when we thought about this question, Rania and Ibrahim and I, we were thinking about your experiences probably as scholars, the beginnings of your experiences with decolonizing research. So where does one commence start decolonizing research?
Should I respond now, Doctor? Okay. And it's okay for my amazing scholar to go from always. I think it almost sometimes. Let me put it this way, and I can only speak for myself, and maybe it might be for others too. It starts at a point where you are having your own dissonance, intellectually, spiritually. There's something that you begin to say to yourself that feels uncomfortable here. I am not feeling, and Dr. Bokers talks about the spiritual. That is so very important. That something, and I would say, in other words, is rocking your soul. Something is rocking your soul, whether it is space that you're engaging with, knowledge that you're engaging with. You might not have a language for it at the time, but you know that something is sort of unsettling. And that's where I think then the agency comes in. And then one begins to search. And that's what we all do. We then go search for scholars to have a conversation. We then go search to read some more. And that, to me, that's how my process started. I began to put myself into spaces that were not the usual spaces. I begin to, sometimes we say the subaltern, begin to look for the spaces where the subaltern voices are raised to the fore. And so that's a way of beginning that decolonizing process. When the knowledge you're engaging with and the space you're engaging with brings that dissonance, brings that discomfort, I think the process might have already begun. And then you begin to ask certain questions and begin to engage. I think it also takes some agency as well, and some intentionality, not to just let that discomfort you're feeling sit, but to really act on it and then begin to ask the kind of questions that might help you to take a different turn and to take a different direction. Because all of us in academia were in the place that Dr. Bogosh was talking about, that space of complicity. All of us have been there, and maybe we are still there in many, many ways. So it's really, how do we engage with that discomfort? And I think that could be a starting point for the process.
Thank you, Dr. Bogoch.
So I have two ideas that are conflicting in my head, and I wrote something down in response to this question. And let me just start reading, and I'll stop quickly. I can still remember my excitement when another envelope arrived in the mail. This was 1988, with surveys from one of the many schools I sampled in my dissertation. I remember teaching myself principal components analysis and enjoying how I got to label the different significant factors within my data set. For the most part, doing the quantitative analysis erased some of my dissatisfaction with school principals' interview responses from which I developed my survey instrument. It's not that the school principals weren't being truthful, they were just being cautious in answering my questions. So at that point of my dissertation, which is a shared experience for everyone who enters the academy, I had no dissidence. I had no intentionality. I was a soldier. I was learning to do research. I was embracing all of this information, and I have to admit, I was loving it. I was loving the whole process. And then something happens. We all get socialized into doing this same process again and again. And we write up our studies in ways that maintain the same formulaic and prescriptive and hegemonic structures that echo the 5-chapter format. It becomes 5 subtitles in a 6,000 to 8,000 word journal article. So instead of a faculty dissertation committee telling us what to change, how to revise, resubmit, we turn to peer reviewers who are doing the same thing, and they're rendering their judgments. And all this time, we're being drawn into this one-size-fits-all model. And so we maintain our sanity by being creative about our ideas. That's how we stay sane. But we continue to learn and practice the research methods the same way. There's a disconnect. And all that I'm saying is, at some point, when we get to what Dr. Lopez called the dissonance and intentionality, we get the unlearning, we allow that same excitement and creativity that goes into the different theories, the alternative ideas, the imagination, and we start bringing that into the methodology. And I'll anticipate where I'll go later. We can't wait for trained methodologists to see this, because they're even more invested in maintaining the status quo than we are as theorists. Let me just check my notes to see that I've basically said what I want to say. You know, so I guess this socialization that I'm talking about, it takes place gradually. It sneaks up on us. And that's what makes us all complicit and being colonized. So if we think of the progression of going from a doctoral student to an instructor, an untenured professor, and then we move into other roles with new obligations, at some point, we do have to move from learning and practicing research to researching to learn.
Thank you very much. So that's very, very interesting, of course, for the process of learning and relearning. Professor Anne, go ahead. I wanted to go back to you, actually. You are muted, but let's remember what you want to share with us. I just one thing to the question. I don't want to be mechanical and move from question one to question two. We have them, so I'm not going to do this. But one question I might want to ask, because I'm interested in paradigms. You in your opening statement, you talked about actively resisting colonial paradigms. How can we do that as researchers? How can we actively resist colonial paradigms, and what does that mean in concrete terms?
Okay. So first of all, before I respond to your question, Dr. Ira said something that really just got me thinking. And, you know, I'm right now coming to you from Zambia, and I would just like to shout out to some of my colleagues who are here from Kwame Nkrumah University in Kabwe, Zambia. The name of the university speaks for itself. And if you do not know who Kwame Nkrumah was, please go research him, because I would say that his spirit is enjoying this conversation that we're having. And you know, oftentimes, as Dr. Arrow was talking about sort of the sort of methodological structures that we get into, and the 5 things that you must have, and some places they literally have it written out on a chart paper that students must fill out the different pieces. So one of the things that came up in the conversations we're having is around this idea that every student in a university doing research must go find a gap. This gap to fill. And so before they even think about what rocks my soul, what is it knowledge I'm so excited to understand, and as Dr. Ara says, to learn, somebody's telling them, but you're not filling a gap. Where is the gap? And this gap conversation goes on ad nauseum until, and at the end of the gap conversation, the excitement, the creativity to learn and unlearn is literally just, the spark is just taken out. And the student then just goes back to conformity to survive and to get out of wherever they're at. And I think as you're talking, Dr. Arrow, that came to me as such an example, rather than saying, what interests you? What is it I want to know? So to your question, Dr. Zori, around how researchers actively change the paradigm. So I'm going to be a little practical and not be a little too theoretical and conceptual. I think, and I'll use myself as an example, I always say that the journey of learning and unlearning is a messy journey. It's not like somebody's going to come and say, here's the road, go for it, you're good, you're safe, there shall be no bumps, no roadblocks, just get your sailboat and away you go. But we know it's not like that, because systems and structures are resistant to change. So we oftentimes, in changing paradigms, one has to think about personal capacity and agency, as well as the context. And when I mentor and give advice, so for example, and let me start with the second piece around sort of context. You've got to begin to understand your context first. And that means building relationships sometimes before you can begin to say, I am going to knock this whole wing of this place down, or I'm going to knock this whole process down. you know, because it's very rarely changes ever singularly takes place. Change usually comes within a collaborative context. So we have to be very careful of how we balance the individual with the collaborative in moving in order to change a paradigm. So like, going back to this whole notion, I'm not saying filling a gap is not something that maybe we might want to ask students to think about. But if you're in a department, you might want to have a conversation with your colleagues around how we're going to change this rather than decrease. So just want to be very practical about that. Context also implies time and space. What you might be able to do after you've built some relationships and you're 3 years into the space is quite different from what you're going to be able to do the second week when you've just been hired. So, you know, we used to say to teacher candidates, don't rush to the principal's office the first day you turn up at school to change the lunch menu. You and so on. So we use it as an example. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, much of what we read and when we engage and we go to conferences and we talk with our scholars, we're now talking a lot in 2023 and beyond about well-being and energy. And how do we do this work within that personal context so we do not become unwell? Because challenging colonization and forms of oppression makes us sick. As Dr. Bogus says, these are acts of violence, epistemic violence, violence upon our knowledge, violence upon our bodies or soul or human beings or very existence. And disrupting that can be, so in terms of what you say, practically, I say, understand your context, build relationships, and always monitor yourself, your engagement, your capacity, where you're at. Sometimes I like to use this term, it's okay on this journey to pause and rest. We cannot replicate capitalism when we're decolonizing. It's almost like an oxymoron in many ways. So that's Dr. Jory, that's some of the suggestions I would make to practically achieve this in terms of sort of some things to think about.
Thank you, thank you. It's very interesting that we have to pause and rest from time to time, especially that we know that sometimes people who are working on this field are faced with huge challenges and criticism, and sometimes they're labeled even that what they're doing is outdated and it's no more what the world needs now. You know, you have plenty of critiques and criticism around that, but I hope we can have time to discuss that later. So I'm going to jump into one of the questions now. As I'm reading it, actually, I have doubts about whether we were good at formulating the question or not. But you can help us, at least, of course, direct the question towards something more useful for all of us. So the question says, how can scholars and educational leaders contribute to the decolonization of theory and praxis? Or theory and praxis, which is, so one word is praxis for both of them, yes? So let me repeat the question. How can scholars and educational leaders contribute to the decolonization of praxis? Anyone who can jump in and start. Yes, go ahead.
I want to, Dr. Lopez referred to Linda, and I too may struggle on the pronunciation, Tehiwai Smith. And she, in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, she defined a Maori term called Wainau. Again, I could be pronouncing it wrong, so I'll spell it. Whanau. It's a persistent way of living and organizing the social world. In terms of research, the Wainau is one of several Maori concepts that have become part of a methodology, a way of organizing a research group, a way of incorporating ethical procedures that report back to the community, a way of giving voice to the different sections of the Maori communities, and a way of debating ideas and issues that impact on the research project. So what am I saying? what is Smith saying? We have to change the relationship that we have with communities, with participants. And that, if you think about what we can do, is we can bring people in who we know we want to talk with, who we know we want to survey. And before we write out the questions, ask them the questions. Ask them what are the questions. We can begin to develop what Dr. Lopez was saying, a more authentic relationship, and have a real communication with participants and subjects, and not maintain the hierarchy of knowledge that currently exists, making the professor the expert and the participants just the source of the knowledge. Because in fact, when we end up writing the analysis, all we're doing is learning from the participants themselves. So who really is the expert? Not us. So if I can quote one more quote, and this is from the foreword of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, written by an Indian scholar, Hami Bhabha. Without the rights of representation and participation in the public sphere, can the subject ever be a citizen in the true sense of the term? What's true for citizenship must also be true for representing and democratizing knowledge. And when we think about why shouldn't the participants, why shouldn't the journal editors, why shouldn't the publishers, why shouldn't we be thinking of everyone as citizens in a way of democratizing the research process? It's not as simple as that, and I know it. So but we do have to develop the language, and we do have to know how to ask the right questions of the right people. So if that's a response to transforming, I don't know, but I think it goes towards answering that question.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Ann, if you have any ideas to add to this question. Otherwise, I think we can ask the question about the role of what we call the gatekeepers now. So you've brought up reviewers and editors and publishers and how they might either contribute to colonizing knowledge or decolonizing knowledge. So in your opinion, what role do they play in advancing this cause?
Because I'm an editor-in-chief, I'm going to speak. Or maybe I should listen first and run and hide after. And by the way, do not forget humor in this work. A decolonizing process is supposed to be a joyful one. Throwing off the yokes of colonization should liberate and free us, free our minds and our souls, and engender laughter, even though the journey might be tough. So we should not forget that. Sometimes we make social justice, decolonizing, anti-racist work look so heavy that nobody is like, so we just want to say that. You know, there's so many things about that, Dr. Jory, that is around the gatekeeping of journals. And I think, you know, I think let me put it, so they're the reviewers, and then they're the editors and so on. And those are two different categories. But so let me speak to the reviewers. What I have noticed in my own role as an editor-in-chief is the randomness of the review and the subjectivity of it, that I do not think. I would love to see a grad student somebody do a thesis on the subjectivity in reviewing journal articles, because they're all coming from their own spaces, their own identities, their own understandings. And sometimes when I read those reviews, are so unwilling to even think outside of the little box that they have experienced their entire lives. And some of the comments, so that's the first thing I would say about that. And the second piece I have noticed from my own experience as an editor-in-chief is the willingness to just keep it in the box. Like, this is the structure, and don't you ever dare step 1 nanometer outside of that structure. So there's a whole army, I think Dr. Bogosh called them army. There's a whole army of ed leader scholars who are trained, willing soldiers in the army of keeping the status quo. And they oftentimes are sometimes we have some of those in the reviewers. And then when it comes to the editors now, the editors make decisions as to whether this is going to be a reject or a come back and revise or accept and so on and so forth. Then within that, there's also now, remember, the publishers who, and this whole structure, as Dr. Bogosh was saying, that we have created, that journals ought to have these kind of percentage of acceptance, and the lower the acceptance rate, the better the journal. Reminds me of the math class. You know, the teacher that used to say the lower the averages in this math class demonstrates the toughness of this course, something like that. And so there are all those paradigms within that keeps that going, the gatekeepers. So in terms of some sort of suggestions to unsettle that, I think, for example, having someone like myself as an editor-in-chief who brings a different perspective helps. And also in those roles. So we have to be intentional in going out to seeking other voices as associate editors and so on, and editors. And the second bit is, I don't know how this is, I'll just put it out there and then we can talk about this as part of the gatekeeping. There's a whole gatekeeping around language. And so scholars where their first language is not English, sometimes are placed in situations with a manuscript that a more decolonizing approach would recognize and make allowances rather than simply disqualifying. So there are some things and ways that this gatekeeping can be disrupted, and things that maybe at conferences or ed leadership conferences, we have sessions that talk about these things and how, these gatekeeping behaviors, and how do we unsettle them.
Yes, thank you very much. And I was present in one of the presentations he gave on this year in April. We talked about different ways of doing research and probably acknowledging those ways of doing research instead of just focusing on the ones that are, as Dr. Bogosh said, the rubrics, following the rubrics and the rules. Dr. Bogosh?
So the first point I want to make is that research is a capitalistic venture. It's a profit-making venture. And the word gatekeepers connote those who make the rules, but also follow the rules. So publishers, editors, reviewers are just following existing rules. The publishers decide on sales and page numbers. Editors decide on the manuscript's relevance to the journal, and peer reviewers, 2 or 3, read and offer constructive, but usually in the subjective way that Dr. Lopez says. It's more for them than necessarily for either the participants in the study they're reviewing, or even for the researcher as they critique. And so just from a practical perspective that doesn't address necessarily the economics or the capitalism of publishing, I would suggest that every study add a question around theory, method, interaction. If theory is driving method and method is driving theory, then the interactions are what becomes important, so that when you write about the conclusions, it's not what you contribute just to theory, it's what you've contributed to methods. And in a very practical way, but I haven't figured out how, and then maybe Dr. Lopez will try this out as editor-in-chief, is to allow the participants to fully participate informing the questions, the designs, and the interpretations of the study, making every single study a collaborative, co-authored piece with participants. Very different from the career ladder approach we take in adding to our CV. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much. Of course, because of time limits, so I know that you have much to say about each point, but we have time restrictions, unfortunately. But people can always interact with you through different modes of interaction, and probably read some of the work you have already published on these issues as well from both sides. I'm going to put some pressure on both of you. I'm so sorry for that. You know, I changed my background picture, moved from university to home, not my home, I mean, but probably a home in the South, because we want to talk about the global North-South context. So decolonizing is about probably deconstruction, if we understand it as such, yes? What about the reconstruction process? If we are going to deconstruct and we are going to just critically look at what have been provided for us in terms of scientific methods, research, publication, and knowledge and everything, and even identity, yes? And this is important, I guess. Is there a reconstruction process? So the pressure I'm going to put on you is that both of you have 3 minutes to both of you to say something about it. So try to bear with me and share some ideas with me on this. So how can we reconstruct? What about the reconstruction process? Are there practical steps to follow? Are there practical models to adopt?
So let me start by questioning whether Frantz Fanon would have accepted, if he were alive today, would he have accepted the global North, the characterizations of the global North and the global South? And my reading is that he would not. And the evidence that I would offer is that what we're seeing in the world today, we're witnessing regressions towards racism, sexism, ethnic dehumanization, genocide, refugees, tribalism, religious fundamentalists in both the global North and the global South. And so Fanon is asking us to erase all the old categories of our minds and to think just in terms of creating a fair and freer world. And so we have to, I think, question the various categories. But the other thing is, in terms of the reconstruction, I think if we listen carefully to what Dr. Lopez has offered in her introductory comments, we begin to see how colonialism and decolonialism may have historical roots, but is very alive in the present. And yet, some people would say we're using terms loosely. So I just want to any of those who participated in the first webinar, when I used the word indigenous, my esteemed colleague from Lebanon, Dr. El Amin, said, no, we don't use indigenous. And I think we've got to state up front how language shapes so much of what we're talking about and acts as both a barrier and a support. So on the last point I want to make was, I'm all in favor of translation. I'm all in favor of researchers writing in their native language. But again, if we listen closely to Dr. El-Amin, he said translations are not sufficient because of colonization. In other words, he was arguing, and I haven't read his book, it's only in Arabic, but he was arguing that Arabic research has been colonized by Western science. And so simply translating that into the language of the journal, whether it's French, Spanish, or English, will not get us to the topic of this webinar, which is how to decolonialize research methods. You know, I think it's always a 2- and 3-part process that we have to go through. So I will turn to my colleague.
Thank you, Professor.
You know, thank you always for leaving us with these wanderings. And so my response to you, and just to follow up on what Dr. Bogert says, I have a question to the question. Should we, does asking about what the restructuring is turns it into a product and takes the uncertainty which is embedded in decolonization out of the process? Because if we begin to think about what reconstruction, we begin to focus on a product. Because remember, if we're decolonizing, many voices now have to bake the cake. And our notion of what that cake might look like might not be the community's notion of the cake. So I think I'm just saying, so I'll just leave that there as a thought. The second thought, because, you know, colonization and capitalism has trained us to think that these are the steps. And this is, once you follow the steps, you're going to get X. And so on. And so just the second thing is, it's a question, and I've never raised it before. It's the first time I'm going to raise it. I have always felt doing research, that's this whole concept of, I can't never say the word, anonymity needs to be rethought. I have never said it because I'm too busy following the rules and doing and so on, but it has always stuck with me. I've always had something. After I go to my participants and we talk and I get information, I've always felt that here I am with this heavy burden of then analyzing, restoring, retelling. And I know folks in participatory action research, sometimes they're participants, and we haven't even talked about ethics reviews and all of those things, and that is a whole nother piece of this research structure as well. But I just want to put that there. Can you imagine we wanted to get information from 10 or 20 principal school heads, and instead of giving pseudonyms and doing all this thing, their voices and their stories are just left. Or maybe we just take videotapes of them, and the whole research project is just playing their tips and letting them construct their questions and speaking about their experiences. And then the findings become whomever listens is what they get from it. Just imagine, you know, and do we have students who we allowed to do that? Will the university take it as a thesis? So these are some of the things that we wrestle with, and I just want to put that there.
Thank you very much. My own probably contribution to this question is reconstruction presupposes that there was nothing before the colonizers came and provide us with knowledge, the knowledge we are using. And in terms of leadership, for example, so I've asked many people working in the field of leadership whether they know what Ubuntu leadership is, and most of them, or at least some of them, think of Ubuntu as an information application or code something, instead of it's a leadership practice in South Africa or in Africa in general. So that is to say that, well, when we talk about the colonized or the oppressed, they already have their own knowledge and it has been oppressed and it's not used, or we need to go back and discover it instead of just reconstructing. thank you very much for the discussion. It was really fruitful, very, very insightful. We are running out of time. I think that I'm going to move to Rania. Rania, turn to Rania now for the QA with our participants.
That's really so, I would say, refreshing, inspiring. Thank you for the amazing discussion. I know Ibrahim wanted, he can't wait, I can imagine. But Ibrahim, if you will open your mic, you literally have 2 minutes. And I will be so strict with that because we need to jump to the participants' questions. And I have a list of things to discuss or to highlight before we're going to Ibrahim. When we're talking about decolonization, I think it's worth mentioning how many of us are aware of different forms and types of decolonization or colonization in our context, either research or practice, or maybe reading something and think that this is sort of knowledge, why it's limiting how we're thinking or limiting how we're going to follow those kind of instructions. I liked how you mentioned soldiers, because unfortunately, this is kind of our educational system, how everyone is just following the rules and we don't feel like we have the power or the courage to start doing something. And that's become, you know, initiating collaborative or shared leadership or different things. And for the indigenous, it's interesting because my friend, Chinese friend, she's mentioned that they're not allowed to use it, or they feel like they're humiliating research if they would label it as indigenous. So I was asking my colleagues, what kind of word do we use for this in Arabic? But till now, I couldn't find an agreed term. Ibrahim.
Yes, it's not a question. It's just a quick comment about when Abdulaziz asked about how can we start to decolonize methodology or research. I think, and I need the comment from Anne. I think one of the first steps is to recognize and acknowledge ourselves as an independent researcher. We are at the same level with all of other researchers to some extent. There is no any ladders when we write or when we think or when we research or when we publish. Let's bring our culture, our context, our idea, our thought, our agenda. The problem is, it's not about just methodology, it's about agenda. So now the agenda, as you mentioned, it's following the idea of well-being and IA and all of these things. However, when we come to our context, we are struggling with the idea of accessing girls to the schools, or for example, having fun to spend in the school. So the idea of decolonizing research can be started in order to bring our voice, our scholars, as Rania did in most of her research, bringing the quotes of our religion or our Arabic scholars or Arabic educators. They have their own thought. Let's bring it to our research and let's think that we are at the same level, not because these quotes or these ideas came from certain scholar in certain university means that it's right, so we can rely on it. So this is, I think, one of the idea that can help us to start to decolonize the research and decolonize methodology. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I will ask the two questions that we have till now, and then you can summarize it just for the sake of time till we have other questions. So Fatima is asking, how can the process of decolonizing education lead to more inclusive and accurate understanding of history, culture, and knowledge systems, while also promoting critical thinking and empowering diverse voices? Where can we build the bridges towards the right reform instead of the watershed that exists with the normal reform? This is the first question. Aziz asked, he would like to know more, or he was commenting about the local that need to have more kind of ownership and control over their context instead of delegating research to experts from the outside. So that would bring also kind of international collaboration or international partnerships. Would like to proceed with those two questions, comments.
Go ahead, Dr. Ira. Did you want to start? No? Well, I'm just going to quickly, okay. To Fatima's question, Fatima, the first part of your question, how can it lead to a more inclusive and accurate understanding of history, culture, and knowledge? I'm going to say it's actually embedded. That if we are decolonizing, it should naturally get us to be more inclusive. So, want to begin to bring in alternative voices, experiences, histories. I was just reading something 2 days ago, and that the continent of Africa had a different name before the colonizers came, Colonial or something. I can't pronounce it, but so much knowledge is there to be unearthed and to be restored and to be retold, and knowledge that and histories that were buried. So Fatima, I think if you just start to do those, and through your research include those, that in of itself will be empowering and will be inclusive and so on. And to build bridges towards the right reform instead of the watershed that existed with no reform. I think we're just going to say quickly and then leave it there. Sometimes we have to acknowledge that reform agendas, as they are set up in sort of neoliberal terms, might sometimes be in dissonance with decolonizing praxis, and so on. So again, in other words, then we say in our world, try to find the space of your agency. Just try to find, you might have to find some space, a little space to begin the work, if you're not able to make those wholesale connections, particularly with reforms from policymakers who are not decolonizing or might not be decolonizing educators, but then you have to work within those systems and all of that. So find a little space for agency with that, I would say.
Yeah. I know we're running out of time, but I think there are lots of things for us to think and rethink and learn and unlearn or relearn about from our practices, and asking simple questions. What Ibrahim was referring to, when I conducted some of the research, many of my colleagues were telling me this is nonsense. Why are you asking like simple questions? And for me, I wanted to ask those simple questions because I need to learn. I need to think about them differently. But when they had seen, I'm so proud that, like now we're sharing those kind of piece of research and with the limitations of how we can publish them, but it's at least we're trying and we're sharing those kind of voices or experiences that we are navigating how we can do these things, even if it's a slow step, but we're getting there. And when someone come with R methodology or qualitative methodology or Q methodology or whatever, we can also generate something new. We can also think of a totally different process, but how we're having the courage and the space to start asking and providing those kind of insights and just simply say, yeah, why not? Let's try it. Like we can have something new and we can have our own understanding and go back maybe to the same data and see how we can analyze it differently. Abdulaziz, Ibrahim, Ira, and for me personally, thank you. This was so refreshing, so supportive, because sometimes we think, no, we should not be doing this. We should go back a little bit and slow down. But now we know now we can continue the same thing that we were aiming to, Abdulaziz.
Thank you so much, Rania. I think that we still have 2 minutes or 3 that we can open to our participants here. If anybody wants to unmute and asks a question or makes a comment or say hi quickly before we wrap up. So we're so happy to have you with us today. We moved from probably 12 participants last time to 26 or 27, 30, I think. We reached 30.
We reached around 34 something.
But I'm sure that there is a problem with the link, that there are some people who could have been with us today, but they couldn't come or join us because of the link. So we're so happy that we have these people with us today. So anybody who is willing, I don't see all the participants on the screen. If we can have them all, so that we can see who wants to unmute and interact with our speakers, with Professor Ann and Professor Bogoch. We're so humbled and honored to have these people with us, Professor Ann and Professor Bogoch. I was so really very, very lucky to meet these people and to meet you, Ibrahim and Rania, of course, and interact with you. We have other people with us here. So please just unmute and talk. So you don't need to get permission, or because I don't see anybody, I just see Professor Ira and Rania on the screen. So now I see.
We should be able to see everyone.
Now we see everyone.
Okay.
So yes, now we see everyone. So
so let us know if you are able or unable.
I'm sorry, Rania. I probably would do it this way because I read a comment from Professor Bogoch. I learned decolonization from Professor Al-Isa.
Dr. Bashir, if you can join us.
Bashir,
now you have
yes. We want to listen to Bashir.
Till she maybe opens her mic, if you can open, just let us know, or I don't know how's the situation around her. We're so pleased to announce, hopefully by end of September, we will have our third session. So stay tuned for the post that we will be sharing. And also please share with us any insights, any idea that how you're implementing. Okay, Bashir.
She can't unmute.
So can I just explain why I wrote that in the chat?
Sure, Professor Bogoch, go ahead.
Bashir, please open your mic. Let me know if you can.
Florida Atlantic University is a very traditional university, and we teach mostly exclusively Western ideas. And when Bashir was a student at FAU, she asked if she could write her comprehensive exam about all the leadership she knew in the Arabic world. And I said, why not? And it was just an amazing work that I shared with some of the faculty. We had never heard of any of these Arabic scholars throughout history. And for me, it was just an important reminder that the Western world is not the exclusive holder of knowledge in the world. And it's really important that professors just be open to learning from all of their students. So that was my backstory on Dr. Alicia.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
I think that might inspire us also all that we might have a kind of a blog or a book about sharing stories or success of how decolonizing or different practices from kind of around the world. So how we can encourage others to think about things differently or about our practices differently. Thank you everyone who joined us today. Abdulaziz.
Yes, yeah, thank you. So I think that Dr. Alisa struggled with, but we've been so happy and lucky to have you with us today. So we promise that we will share with you the coming session. I think in probably 1 month from now that we're going to have our third session. Thank you, Professor Anne, for joining us today. Thank you for sharing insightful comments, insightful ideas around this issue. I've been really thrilled to read some of the articles and books that you have written around this. Professor Bogoch, it's always a pleasure to be with you here and to listen to you and listen to your wise ideas and wisdom, of course. Yes. Thank you all. Ibrahim, Rania, thank you so much.
Thank you, Abdulaziz. Thank you, everyone.
For preparing for this platform. Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Goodbye.